Journey to Banff. The morning began with the smell of fresh coffee and the quiet creak of the old porch swing. Henry sat there with Buddy at his feet, the dog's ears twitching every time a jay called from the trees. The field beyond their house still glistened with dew, the grass greener than it had any right to be this late in the season. The magic of the hidden meadow lingered in him. His back felt looser, his stride stronger, and when he stretched, it was without the groans he had grown used to over the years. Margaret stepped outside, pulling her sweater tight around her shoulders. "Henry," she said, her voice soft but with that spark he'd come to recognize, "I've been thinking, we should go somewhere. Not just anywhere. I want to see Banff." He looked up, blinking against the sun. "Banff? As in Canada? The Rockies?" "Yes," she said, her smile breaking slowly like sunlight through clouds. "The mountains, the lakes, the fresh air. I read about it in an article the other day. Banff National Park, Lake Moraine, the Bow River. People say it's like walking into a painting." Henry rubbed his chin. The thought of a long drive crossing into another country once might have felt daunting. But now, with this new vigor humming in his bones, the idea felt less like a burden and more like a challenge he was eager to meet. "Banff it is," he said at last, grinning. "Let's see if the old Ford's ready for another adventure." Buddy barked as if on cue, his tail thumping against the porch. Margaret laughed, that warm, melodic laugh Henry loved. She bent down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Guess that's 3 votes in favor." By noon, they had the truck packed. The Ford F-150 sat in the driveway like a faithful horse, its red paint still gleaming from Henry's last effort in the barn. A cooler with sandwiches and thermoses of coffee went behind the seats, along with Margaret's neatly folded blanket and Henry's road atlas, though he admitted he'd probably rely more on Margaret's phone than the dog-eared pages. Margaret had slipped a notebook into her bag. She'd been writing again lately, small sketches of thought, poems that came to her in the quiet hours. Banff, she hoped, might bring her words alive again. The road rolled out before them, 2 lanes stretching toward the horizon. Autumn clung to the edges of the trees, splashes of orange and crimson against the deep green pines. Buddy sat in the back seat with his head stuck proudly out the window, ears flapping in the wind, tongue lolling happily. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Henry said, one hand loose on the wheel, the other drumming against the dash in rhythm with the classic rock station crackling on the radio. "Take It Easy" by the Eagles played, and Henry couldn't help but sing along, his voice low but certain. Margaret joined in on the chorus, and for a moment the truck was filled with something lighter than air, youth rediscovered, even if just for a song. Hours passed in that easy rhythm of road trips, long stretches of highway punctuated by small towns with gas stations, diners, and hand-painted signs promising world's best pie or fresh maple fudge. They stopped at one such diner in North Dakota, a squat building with red shutters and a neon coffee cup glowing in the window. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of bacon and hash browns. Truckers hunched over mugs of black coffee, and a family of 4 squeezed into a booth by the window. A waitress in a pink uniform came over, pad in hand. "What'll it be, folks?" 2 coffees, slice of apple pie," Henry said without hesitation. "And a bowl of water for him, if you don't mind," Margaret added, nodding to Buddy, who was lying obediently under the table, but watching every plate that passed with keen interest. The waitress chuckled. "We don't get many 4-legged customers, but I'll see what I can do." They ate slowly, savoring the flaky crust, the cinnamon that clung to the apples. Margaret looked out the window at the endless sweep of plains beyond. "You know," she said, "I think it's the in-between places I love the most. Not just the destinations. The little towns, the diners, the people who smile at you even though you're strangers." Henry reached across the table and took her hand. "That's the whole point of the road, isn't it? Not just where it ends, but what you see along the way." Back on the highway, the land began to rise, hills rolling like waves until they hinted at the mountains still hours away. They passed signs for provincial parks, campgrounds, and historical markers that told of fur traders and First Nations tribes. Margaret read some aloud from her phone, filling the cab with stories of explorers, trappers, and the railroad that once carved its path through wilderness. By evening, they had crossed into Canada. The border guard gave them a polite but firm once-over asked the usual questions, then waved them through. Margaret let out a little cheer. "We're really here!" They pulled off at a scenic overlook just as the sun dipped behind the Rockies. The peaks rose in jagged majesty, their crowns dusted with early snow. The air was sharper, colder, carrying the scent of pine and stone. Henry shut off the engine, and for a moment all they heard was the ticking of the cooling motor and Buddy's excited panting. Then the silence of the mountains settled over them, a silence so vast it seemed to echo in their bones. Margaret wrapped her arm through Henry's. "Worth it already," she whispered. He nodded, unable to take his eyes off the horizon. "And we've only just begun." Buddy barked once, sharp and clear, his voice carrying into the vastness of the Rockies as if to announce their arrival. The mountains did not answer, but they seemed to stand a little taller, welcoming these new travelers into their embrace. The next morning broke with a chill that hinted at winter, though the calendar still swore it was early autumn. Frost glazed the grass along the roadside, sparkling like 1,000 tiny diamonds in the first light of day. Henry turned the key, and the Ford rumbled awake, its breath puffing into the cold air like a horse on a frosty morning. "Banff today," Margaret said softly, pulling her scarf tighter. There was something childlike in her tone, as if she were about to unwrap a long-anticipated gift. They followed the Trans-Canada Highway westward, the road-hugging valleys where rivers cut silver lines through the trees. The Rockies no longer loomed at a distance. They surrounded them now, vast walls of granite and snow, their faces glowing orange in the rising sun. Buddy shifted in the back seat, nose pressed to the glass, ears pricked. He whined softly, sensing the excitement of his humans. By midday, they rolled into Banff, the town cradled between towering peaks. The first thing Henry noticed was how different it felt from the American towns they had passed through. Main Street was alive but not rushed. Cars moved slowly, yielding to pedestrians bundled in hiking gear. Shops displayed racks of colorful jackets, postcards of turquoise lakes, and maple leaf emblems on everything from mugs to socks. The air carried a crispness sharper than anything he'd breathed back home, tinged with wood smoke from a bakery down the block, mixed with the earthy scent of pine. And the accents, though subtle, were unmistakably Canadian. People greeted one another with, "How's it going, eh?" And every cashier or server seemed to end sentences with "sorry" or "thanks so much." Margaret's eyes sparkled as they parked near Banff Avenue. "It feels almost European, doesn't it?" she said, pointing at the chalet-style buildings with their pitched roofs and flower boxes. "Like a Swiss village, only Canadian." Henry chuckled. "Yeah, you won't find this kind of charm in North Dakota." They strolled down the street, Buddy trotting happily at their side. A busker played a fiddle on the corner, the lively notes of a reel carrying into the cool air. Tourists gathered, snapping photos with the mountains rising like painted backdrops behind the performer. Their first stop was a cafe with wide windows facing the peaks. Inside, the decor mixed rustic wood with modern touches, antler chandeliers overhead, and sleek stone counters where a barista worked the espresso machine. Henry ordered a double-shot Americano out of habit. Margaret, more adventurous, tried the maple latte. When the drinks arrived, Margaret held hers to her nose, inhaling the sweet aroma. "Only in Canada," she said, taking a sip. Her smile widened instantly. "Oh, Henry, you have to try this." He did, reluctantly, then raised his brows. "That's dangerous," he admitted. "If we stay here too long, I'll be addicted." The barista overheard and laughed. "Happens to the best of us," she said, sliding a dog treat across the counter for Buddy. Margaret's notebook was out before long, her pen scratching across the page as she tried to capture the textures of the place. The way the light shifted through the window, the sound of laughter from a group of skiers planning their next run, the faint clink of mugs as locals greeted each other. In the afternoon, they explored Banff National Park. A short drive brought them to Bow Falls, where the river thundered over rocks, throwing mist into the crisp air. The roar of the water was almost too much for conversation, so they simply stood together, Henry's arm around Margaret's shoulders, Buddy barking once before deciding to sit and watch in solemn wonder. Later they drove toward Lake Minnewanka. The name itself made Henry grin. "Sounds like something out of a tall tale," he joked. But the sight of the long, glacial lake silenced him. The water was a surreal shade of blue-green, as if the sky had melted into the valley floor. A Canadian family picnicked nearby, their laughter ringing out as they unpacked smoked salmon, cheese curds, and butter tarts. They waved cheerfully when Buddy trotted over, tails wagging on both sides, dog and children alike. Margaret whispered, "They're friendlier than most people back home." Henry nodded. "There's something easy about folks here, less guarded." He paused, then chuckled. "Maybe it's the maple syrup in their veins." That evening, as twilight painted the mountains purple, they checked into a small lodge on the edge of town. Not one of the luxury resorts Margaret had read about, but a cozy wooden inn with a stone fireplace in the lobby and the faint scent of cedar in the air. The owner, a cheerful woman in her 50s, handed them the key. "Room with a view," she said, her accent soft but distinct. "The peaks look their best at sunrise. Don't miss it." Their room overlooked Cascade Mountain, the craggy summit silhouetted against the darkening sky. Henry dropped their bags with a groan, not from pain, but from the satisfaction of travel well earned. Margaret stood by the window, her hand pressed to the glass. "Henry, it feels like the world is bigger here, wilder, as if it's waiting for us to discover it." Buddy curled up on the rug, sighing deeply, his paws twitching as if already dreaming of the trails to come. Henry stepped up behind her, wrapping her in his arms. "Then tomorrow," he said, "we'll start exploring." They walked later that night through the quiet streets of Banff. The shops were closing, their warm lights winking out one by one, but the bars and pubs were alive with music and chatter. The glow of neon signs promised poutine, craft beer, and live folk bands. They passed a group of young travelers laughing over steaming cups of hot chocolate, their hiking boots still dusty from the trails. Henry and Margaret exchanged a glance that carried no envy, only recognition. They had been young once, and now in this new season of life, they had discovered a different kind of adventure, one that was slower, deeper, but no less thrilling. Margaret squeezed his hand. "Banff was a good idea, wasn't it?" Henry smiled. "Best you've had all year." The mountains towered above them, silent and eternal, their peaks catching the light of 1,000 stars. And as Henry and Margaret walked back to their lodge, Buddy trotting faithfully between them, it felt as if the town itself had embraced them. Not as tourists, but as fellow travelers on life's winding road. The morning cracked open with a blaze of sunlight spilling over the peaks. The mountains looked sharper, almost drawn in ink, their snow caps gleaming like someone had sprinkled sugar over them. Margaret was already up, tugging the curtains aside, her excitement bubbling over. "Henry, you gotta see this. It's like we woke up in a postcard." Henry groaned, rolling over, but Buddy had other ideas. The golden retriever bounded onto the bed, tail thumping hard enough to rattle the headboard. All right, Henry muttered, scratching behind Buddy's ears. "You win. Guess it's time to hit the trail." After a hearty Canadian-style breakfast, pancakes drowned in maple syrup, a side of bacon that practically melted in the mouth, and strong coffee, they packed up for a day hike. The lodge owner had recommended a trail near the hoodoos, those strange limestone spires that jutted up from the valley. Henry pulled on his old flannel shirt, the one with the elbows worn thin. "You think I'll pass for a local?" Margaret laughed, sliding her knit beanie over her hair. "Maybe if you say eh after every sentence." The trailhead wasn't far, just outside of town. They parked the Ford and started up, Buddy leading the charge, nose down, tail waving like a flag. "Don't pull too hard, Bud," Henry said, gripping the leash. "I'm not 20 anymore." A pair of hikers passed them on the way down, young Canadians with backpacks bigger than their torsos. One raised a hand. "Morning, eh? Watch out up there. Bit of ice on the switchbacks." Margaret called back, "Thanks, we'll take it slow." Then she turned to Henry, smirking. "Told you. Eh?" Henry chuckled. "Guess it's official. We're in Canada now." The climb grew steeper, the air thinner. Pines lined the trail, their needles dusted with frost. Every so often, the trees opened, revealing sweeping views of the Bow River winding like a silver ribbon far below. Margaret stopped to catch her breath. "Good grief, Henry. My legs are screaming, but wow!" He slipped an arm around her shoulders, both of them gazing out. "Makes you forget the aching knees, huh?" "Almost," she said with a grin. Buddy barked suddenly, ears pricked. A mule deer stood just off the trail, its big dark eyes fixed on them. For a moment time froze, the deer's breath puffing in the cold, Buddy's quiet whine, Margaret's hand tightening on Henry's. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the deer bounded away, vanishing into the trees. "Now that's a National Geographic moment," Henry whispered. By midday, they reached the hoodoos. The limestone pillars rose like ghostly sentinels, glowing pale against the evergreen forest. Other hikers milled about, snapping photos, munching trail mix. A Canadian couple offered to take their picture, and Henry handed over his phone. "Say cheese," the woman sang out. "Cheddar," Henry replied, making Buddy tilt his head as if in confusion. The hikers laughed, handing the phone back. Margaret leaned over to check the photo. "Not bad. We almost look athletic." "Almost," Henry echoed. They found a flat rock to sit on for lunch. Margaret unpacked sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, thick slices of turkey and cheddar with a smear of mustard. Henry bit into his inside. Nothing like a good sandwich on a hike. Beats freeze-dried astronaut food any day. Margaret pointed at his thermos. "Pass the coffee, cowboy." He handed it over, watching her sip with satisfaction. The mountains stretched endless around them, their silence broken only by wind whispering through the trees. On the way back down, the trail grew crowded. A group of loud American tourists trudged past, complaining about the cold. "Figures," Henry muttered. "We drive 1,000 miles north and still run into folks from Ohio." Margaret elbowed him playfully. "Be nice. They're just missing their warm beaches." When they reached the parking lot, Buddy leaped into the truck bed, tongue lolling. Henry climbed behind the wheel, stretching his back with a groan. "Remind me next time to bring a younger set of knees." That evening, after a hot shower and a nap that felt almost sinful, they headed into town for dinner. Banff's streets glowed with string lights, and the air smelled of wood smoke and grilled meat. They picked a cozy steakhouse with plaid tablecloths and elk antlers mounted on the wall. The waiter, a young man with shaggy hair and a thick Alberta accent, grinned as he handed them menus. "You folks gotta try the bison burger. It's a Banff classic." Henry raised a brow at Margaret. "What do you think? Go local?" "Absolutely," she said. "When in Canada?" The burgers arrived juicy and piled high with a side of poutine, crispy fries smothered in gravy and cheese curds. Margaret took one bite and closed her eyes. "This is outrageous. How have we never had this before?" Henry forked up a gooey mess of fries. "Because back home we'd call this a heart attack on a plate. But a delicious one," she shot back. They toasted with glasses of Canadian craft beer, clinking them together with a quiet cheers. Later, they strolled back through the cool night air. Buddy trotted alongside, tail swishing, pausing to sniff at lampposts and snowbanks. Henry slipped his hands into his jacket pockets. "You know, Marge, I gotta admit, you were right about this trip. It's good for the soul." She smiled up at him, cheeks pink from the cold. "It's not just the trip, Henry. It's us. We're still out here, still doing it." He pulled her closer, their boots crunching in rhythm on the frosty sidewalk. "Yeah," he said softly. "We still got some miles left in us." They reached the lodge just as the stars broke fully overhead, glittering sharp against the velvet sky. From somewhere down the street came the sound of a folk band playing in a pub, the fiddle fast, the laughter loud. Margaret paused at the door, looking back at the mountains standing silent and eternal. "Tomorrow?" she whispered. "Let's see more." Henry squeezed her hand. "Tomorrow," he agreed. Buddy barked once, as if sealing the deal. The morning sky was brushed with streaks of pink and gold when Henry eased the old Ford out of the lodge parking lot. The engine rumbled faithfully, as if it too was eager for the day's adventure. Buddy stuck his head out the rear window, ears flapping, nose twitching at every new scent. Margaret had the guidebook open on her lap, finger tracing the route north. "Lake Louise first, then, if we've got the energy, we'll drive the Icefields Parkway to the Columbia Icefield." Henry smirked. "Energy? After yesterday's hike, my knees are still filing complaints." She reached over, giving his arm a squeeze. "Oh, hush, you loved it. Admit it." He chuckled, eyes on the winding road. Yeah, I did. Just don't tell the doctor back home. He'd say we're crazy." The drive to Lake Louise was nothing short of cinematic. The Trans-Canada unfurled through valleys and around bends, each turn revealing a new mountain more majestic than the last. Pines thick as soldiers lined the slopes, while waterfalls spilled silver ribbons down rock faces. Margaret leaned against the window, whispering, "It's like driving through a painting." Henry nodded. though he kept his hands steady on the wheel. America's got some pretty scenery, but this is another level. They arrived mid-morning, the parking lot already filling with tourists. As they walked the short path, the air grew colder, sharper. And then the lake revealed itself. Lake Louise, a turquoise jewel cradled by towering peaks and the mighty Victoria Glacier at the far end. Margaret gasped, hand to her chest. Henry, I've seen pictures, but nothing prepares you for this. Henry whistled low. Looks fake, like somebody dropped food coloring in the water. Buddy barked once, bounding toward the shore, though Henry held the leash firm. They stood there for a long moment, letting the grandeur wash over them. Around them, tourists snapped photos, couples posed with selfie sticks, and a group of Japanese hikers murmured in awe. But Henry and Margaret hardly noticed. For them, it was enough just to be. They found a bench near the historic Fairmont Chateau Lake Louise Hotel. Its turrets and stone walls rose elegantly, blending old-world charm with luxury. Margaret nudged Henry. Can you imagine staying there? He grinned. With our budget? Maybe if we sell the Ford. She laughed, shaking her head. I wouldn't trade our little lodge for that. Not when we've got Buddy hogging the rug. A Canadian couple sat nearby, sipping from thermoses. The man tipped his toque and said, Cold morning, eh? But the view warms you right up. Henry nodded. Can't argue with that. The woman added, if you drive up the Icefields Parkway, keep your eyes peeled. Might spot some bighorn sheep or even a grizzly. Margaret's eyes widened. A grizzly? Henry muttered. Now that's something I don't need to run into. By noon, they were back in the truck, heading north on the Icefields Parkway. The highway was hailed as one of the most scenic drives in the world, and it didn't take long to see why. Glacier-fed rivers sparkled beside the road, and jagged peaks loomed like ancient guardians. Margaret read aloud from the guidebook. They call this the backbone of the Rockies, over 100 glaciers along this stretch. Henry whistled. Back home, we brag about a good fishing hole. Up here, they've got glaciers like yard decorations. Buddy barked in agreement, nose pressed to the glass as if counting every mountain. They pulled over at a viewpoint where the valley dropped away to reveal Crowfoot Glacier. The ice gleamed blue-white, carved like a claw gripping the rock. A tour bus unloaded, and a cluster of teenagers spilled out, snapping selfies and shivering in hoodies. Margaret shivered too, tugging her jacket tighter. Feels like the air itself is ancient. Henry wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Makes you realize how small we are, huh? She leaned into him. Small, but lucky. By late afternoon, they reached the Columbia ice field. The Athabasca Glacier stretched before them, a frozen river of time. Signs marked the glacier's retreat, each one farther back along the trail, evidence of decades of melting. They joined a small group led by a Parks Canada guide, a young woman with a red jacket and an easy smile. Welcome, folks, she said. You're standing on one of the largest ice fields south of the Arctic Circle. The ice beneath your feet could be as much as 1,000 years old. Henry muttered to Margaret, makes my 71 years feel like peanuts. The guide overheard and chuckled. That's the spirit. Now, watch your step. The ice can be slick. They ventured onto the glacier in a specialized snow coach, its massive tires crunching over the ice. Margaret pressed her hand to the window, marveling at the vast expanse. Henry, it feels like another planet. Buddy, allowed on board thanks to his calm nature, sat alert, nose twitching at the cold air that seeped through the vents. The other passengers smiled, snapping photos of the golden retriever in his harness. When the coach stopped, they stepped onto the ice itself. The wind cut sharp, but the silence was profound. Only the creak of the glacier and the occasional call of a raven broke it. Margaret bent to scoop a handful of snow, pressing it to her lips. Pure, she whispered, like tasting the earth's memory. Henry took a cautious step, boots crunching. Careful, Marge. If you slip, I'm not carrying you back. She laughed, the sound echoing across the ice. Then we'll both go down together. As the sun began its slow descent, they drove back toward Banff. The peaks glowed pink and gold, the valleys deepening into shadow. Henry hummed along to an old Eagles song on the radio, tapping the steering wheel. Margaret, notebook open again, scribbled furiously. Henry, this place, it's more than beauty. It's perspective. The mountains, the glaciers, they remind you that life's bigger than our little worries. He glanced at her, his smile soft. Couldn't have said it better myself. Buddy sighed contentedly in the back, already drifting into dreams. They stopped at a roadside diner before returning to the lodge. Neon lights buzzed and the smell of grilled burgers filled the air. Inside, truckers mingled with tourists, the chatter a blend of Canadian ace and American drawls. Henry ordered a slice of pecan pie. Margaret went for butter tarts, and they shared bites across the table. Margaret grinned, crumbs at the corner of her lips. Banff has spoiled me, from maple lattes to glaciers to butter tarts. I may never go home. Henry raised his fork like a toast. Then here's to being spoiled. That night, back at the lodge, they sat on the balcony wrapped in blankets. Buddy curled at their feet. The Milky Way spilled across the sky, unpolluted by city lights. Henry exhaled slowly. Marge, this trip, it's one for the books. She rested her head on his shoulder. And the book still being written. The mountains stood tall around them, ancient and silent, as if nodding in agreement. The morning of their departure came too quickly. Banff's peaks were cloaked in a soft mist, as though the mountains themselves were reluctant to let them go. Henry loaded the last bag into the Ford's bed, giving the tailgate a firm pat. Buddy leapt in after, tail wagging, ready for whatever road lay ahead. Margaret lingered with the lodge owner, exchanging hugs and promises to return. "You two take care now," the woman said warmly. "And don't forget, fall is the best time for the larches." "We won't," Margaret smiled. Henry shook hands with a couple they'd met on the trail the day before. "Good folks up here," he muttered as they climbed into the truck. "Feels like leaving family." The Ford rolled slowly down Banff Avenue, past cafes they had grown fond of, and the shops with their maple leaf souvenirs. The town grew smaller in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the towering Rockies. Margaret reached over, resting her hand on Henry's arm. "So, what's next?" He grinned, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Heard there's a little waterfall out east. Goes by the name Niagara." Margaret laughed, the sound light and hopeful. Buddy barked as if seconding the plan, and with that the Ford rumbled eastward, carrying them out of the mountains and into the promise of another adventure. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.